'Tis the season to make something joyful, and I have just the project for that. Today on Squirreland Finishes a Thing, I'm going to put the finishing touches on this. Everyone, I'd like to introduce you to my friend Lumpy the Penguin. Penguin? No, it's Penguin. I started working on him back in 2015, way before I started recording videos for projects, and I just never got around to finishing this little guy. So today's video is going to be a little different, mostly in that I will only be showing the last half of this project. I have about a dozen or so projects that were started many years ago, and they're all half finished, which means that I'll be making a few more of these Squirreland Finishes a Thing videos down the line. To start the process of finishing this little guy, I'm going to begin with correcting part of the original sculpt that has just never looked right to me. It's like he knows what I'm about to do to him. Lumpy, forgive me. It's going to turn out okay in the end, I promise. Well, with that horrificness out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and sculpt it in the way that it should have looked in the first place. Now that is definitely a step in the right direction. Other than looking better, a reason why I'm sculpting it this way is because the way that the eyes were sculpted before would have been very difficult to hard coat properly. With this new sculpt, it'll be much easier for me to hard coat and paint. Part of the reason why I never finished this project in the first place is because of the original sculpt of the eyes, and not really liking the way that it looked, as well as the difficulty that I knew that I would have in hard coating them. And yes, it may have taken me 6 years to figure that out. Anyways, moving on. Throughout the first part of this video where I finalize the sculpt, there's going to be a lot of me checking and rechecking the placement of Lumpy's sled to make sure that everything fits properly, so bear with me on that. Now that I figured out the placement of everything, I'm going to work on attaching his left flipper, or wing, or paddle? Before I glue on his left arm, I got a little sidetracked on what should have been a glaring omission. Lumpy doesn't have a tail. I grabbed a little bit of scrap foam that was left over from this year's giant pumpkin project that looked like it might fit. I did a little bit of fine tuning to the shape and glued it on with some 2-part rigid expansion foam. I used the expansion foam because the part didn't fit perfectly, and the foam would expand to fill in all the little gaps. This way there will be something for me to blend into the rest of the sculpt. With the block glued on for his tail, I can get back to gluing on his left arm. I used hot melt glue to glue it on. I can do so without melting the styrofoam because my glue gun has a high and a low setting. The low setting is hot enough to melt the glue, but not the foam. Unfortunately, I forgot to check the setting, and the arm fell off while I was working on fixing his foot. No trouble though, I'll adjust the setting on my glue gun and reattach the arm. Next, I'll just be working on shaping his arm and blending it into the rest of his body. For Lumpy's right arm, I wanted to have it up, like he was waving from the top of the sledding hill. The original right arm was a bit short for what I needed, so I made a new one. With his right arm attached, I added a bit of foam to the back of his arm so I could blend it into his body better. Just like I did with the tail, I glued the extra foam on with the expansion foam. While the expansion foam hardens, I'll start work on shaping the tail. Now that the expansion foam has had some time to harden, I'll work on shaping his right arm and blending it into his body. The last thing that I need to do is to glue him down to the wooden base with the expansion foam. After 6 years of seeing Lumpy in a partially finished state, I have to say, it's really nice to see him fully sculpted and almost ready for hard coating. To securely attach Lumpy's sled, I need to embed some attachment points in his hand, his tummy, and his base platform. Before I glue the blocks of wood down, I'm first going to clean off all the extra expansion foam that squeezed out when I glued them down. Well, looks like everything lines up. Next I'll add a bit of foam around the block that I glued to the base. This way I can disguise the attachment block as a little mound of snow. Next I'm going to use some plaster to patch any holes or seams so that everything will be nice and smooth for hard coating. With everything patched up, I let them dry overnight. Now that the plaster is dried, a bit of sanding and it's on to the next step. For this project, I'm going to be hard coating with epoxy resin and fiberglass cloth. First I'm going to do some prep work and cut out some sections of fiberglass that will hopefully fit once I start applying the resin. It's time to glove up. I'll be using resin from West Systems. This is not a sponsorship, just what I'm using. Since I'm using epoxy resin, I'll be able to apply the resin directly to the styrofoam without any issue. If I was using polyester resin, the resin would react to the styrofoam and dissolve the foam. Epoxy resin is also a low odor resin, as opposed to polyester resin, which has a very strong smell. I do have a window open with a fan blowing in fresh air. Before I was interrupted, I was saying that I do have a window open with a fan blowing in fresh air right behind me at all times while using this stuff. When I applied the resin, I started by coating everything with resin first, and then laying down my first layer of fiberglass cloth over that. Since it was a clean break, I can just glue it back on with hot glue and it's like nothing ever happened. Also, I'm just going to go ahead and get some resin and cloth on the gimpy arm before I do anything else that's super smart with it. This piece ended up being a little long towards the bottom, so I just trimmed it to fit. For any spots that weren't covered by my other pieces of fiberglass cloth, I cut smaller patchy pieces and stuck them anywhere that they were needed. With the first layer done, it's time to get some more pieces cut to lay down a second layer of fiberglass cloth. It's been a few hours since I laid down the first layer and working on this one. This means that the resin from the first is nice and tacky, and it's very easy to stick down any pieces of cloth that I cut out. With this second layer, I wanted to be sure to cover any seams from the first as well as coat any areas that I may have missed. Now that Lumpy looks a bit like a mummy, it's time to seal everything down with a fresh batch of resin. I let the last batch of resin set for a couple more hours, and while it was still tacky, I did one more coat of resin just to hopefully smooth things out a bit. I left Lumpy to cure overnight and give the first layers of resin a chance to harden. Next I need to sand down and smooth out the last coat of resin before I apply the next layers. Resin dust is very hazardous, so for much of my powered sanding that I do, I'll be wearing this face mask to protect my eyes and lungs. I wasn't having much luck knocking down the high points with my mouse sander or my orbital. I was getting the best results with the barrel sander on my Dremel, which is good because it's definitely going to test my patience with being such a small grinding surface. Good thing that this project isn't bigger than this. Once I finished with the Dremel, I did a quick bit of sanding by hand to smooth things out even more. With the sanding done, I'm going to do my prep work again and get some sections of fiberglass cloth cut and put to the side. For this round, I'm going to focus on putting fabric on any of the seams from the last layer. Similar to the last layer, I coat the whole sculpture in resin, then wait a couple of hours for it to become tacky. As it cures, it gets very sticky, and it's the perfect time to place the pieces of fiberglass cloth that I cut out earlier. Once the cloth is set, I saturate it with even more resin. After I finish saturating the cloth with resin, I let it set for a couple more hours before applying additional coat of resin and letting the whole thing cure overnight. Now that the resin from the previous day is fully hardened, I grind down any rough areas and sand the whole sculpture as smooth as possible. With the entire sculpture smoothed out, I apply a coat of resin with no fiberglass cloth. I'm going to do this a couple of times, and in between coats of resin I'm going to sand down the high points over the whole sculpture. This will hopefully result in a smooth final surface. The tips of his arms didn't get coated in fiberglass cloth very well, so I used some rolled up strands of scrap fiberglass to add extra strength to them. Now that the resin has fully cured, it's time to sand everything down smooth. Again. Finally, the last coat of resin. And with that, I let them sit overnight to let the resin fully cure. For this layer, I tried to only hand sand everything and just use the Dremel in hard to reach spots or where a drip had accumulated. Next, I'm finally getting to the painting part and I'm laying down the first coat of primer. Unfortunately, that first coat of primer needs to be sanded almost completely off to smooth things out even further. Any remaining primer will be left behind in the low spots in the resin. When I add the second coat of primer, the whole sculpture should be very smooth. Here is how he looked before he got the second coat of primer. He's all ready for the final stages of painting. Next, I'm going to give him 2 coats of semi-gloss white paint. But first I rough up the primer just a bit with a light bit of sanding. In between the coats of paint, I'll rough it up just a bit each time. Before I start painting on his tuxedo, I sketch out where I want it to go with a pencil. This way, if I don't make gouges into the white paint, I should be able to wipe away any pencil lines that don't get covered by the black paint. Initially, I was going to paint the edge of the black by hand, but it proved to be very difficult when I tried to paint his widow's peak, so I decided to try masking it off with tape instead. I prepped for the final coat of black by sanding any bumps or drips in the first coat. Next, I painted 2 coats of orange on his beak and feet. The orange paint is actually the same orange that I used on the giant pumpkin. The last 2 steps are to paint on his eyes and tongue. And there he is. I recorded me attaching his sled, but when I looked at the footage, the camera angles didn't make it look like much, so I decided not to include it. So, real talk here. I was having a lot of fun finishing this little guy, except for when it came to the paint job. Unfortunately, my first attempt at painting him white didn't go so great. The 2 paints that I used for the primer and the white paint reacted to one another, and I ended up having to sand it all off and try again. However, I couldn't get all of the reactive paint out of the low spots and around his eyes. The little bits of paint that got left behind continued to react to every subsequent layer that I put on, which made them gummy and not dry properly. This means that to properly correct the issue, I need to clean off all of the old paint and start from new. I just didn't have time to do that and still finish him in time for the video, so I had to make the best of it. Also, if you're looking at the way that the eyes are painted on and thinking, wow, that looks awful, yeah, I agree. That's not the way that I pictured it in my head when making it. The eyes definitely should have been a lot softer and they should have been airbrushed on. The problem there is that I'm not an airbrush artist. I am going to come back to this after the holidays are over and properly strip the reactive paint, start over, and get an airbrush artist to help me make them look better. I'm very disappointed that I couldn't deliver a better product at the end of this video. Although the big success story here is that this is the first time that I've been able to finish a fiberglass and resin coated project. I have a couple old projects that I started with this type of coating, but they never got finished. So when taking this project on, I was very concerned that I wouldn't be able to finish it at all. Now, I have a very durable, amusement park quality penguin, albeit with a pad paint job. So in that regard, this project was a success. I'll include a little something with his new paint job in one of next year's holiday videos. Until then, I'll catch you in the next one. Thanks for watching.